Hi, I'm Laura Flanders, and this is CityWorks, a production of the City University of New York School of Labor and Urban Studies and CUNY TV. Every month, CityWorks explores the lives of working people on the job, at home, in our communities to see how we can better achieve social and economic equality. April 24th this year marks the 10th anniversary of a building collapse in Bangladesh that killed 1,134 people and injured thousands more. The Rana Plaza disaster at a building in Dhaka that housed 5 clothing factories was the deadliest disaster in the industry's history. Today, Bangladesh is the second largest exporter of clothing in the world. A long list of U.S. and European brands is produced there, and the sector accounts for 84% of all of Bangladesh's exports. Back in 2013, the disaster at Rana Plaza sparked a call for international action. An accord was agreed to, legally binding factories to pay for safety inspections. Unions and worker organizations led the way in establishing and enforcing those accords. And in 2021, an expanded international accord came about that included more health and safety provisions and expanded to garment factories in Pakistan. Over 170 fashion brands have signed on. Still, labor abuses in garment factories remain rife. Around the world, factory owners and managers often fire pregnant workers or deny maternity leave, retaliate against workers who form or try to join unions, and require mandatory overtime. Sexual harassment of female workers is commonplace. Getting a clear picture of company supply chains is just one of the many obstacles organizers face in holding even well-known companies to account. Charlene Abenaar is the executive director of the New York Committee for Occupational Safety and Health, or NICOSH, where she oversees and develops NICOSH's advocacy work and campaigns. She's also the co-founder of the New York Healthy Nail Salons Coalition, a project we reported on right here, and which successfully advocated for the passage of statewide legislation to combat wage theft and unhealthy conditions in nail salons. Charlene is joined by Teresa Haas, the director of Global Strategies for Workers United, a labor union that represents workers in the apparel, distribution, food service, hospitality, manufacturing, and other industries across the U.S. and Canada. Well, it is hard to think of two people better placed to discuss this. Charlene Abenaar and Teresa Haas, welcome. So glad to have you with us. Let's start in Bangladesh, if you don't mind. Teresa, coming to you, just remind people, maybe they kind of remember references to Rana Plaza, but what happened there?
Absolutely, Laura. Thank you so much, and thank you for having me. Just to remind everyone about that disaster, and as you said, we are now coming up on the 10-year anniversary. This was a building in Bangladesh that housed 5 garment factories, producing mainly for US and European markets, for companies including Walmart and Benetton and Children's Place and Joe Fresh. And it was located in a country that had a long history of deadly fires and building collapses, and also a long history of brands taking no action to address what was a years-long crisis. And what happened back in 2013, the day prior to the collapse actually, workers had noticed cracks in the building. And given the history in Bangladesh, what they knew about what had happened before to other workers, they were understandably afraid and worried for their lives. And although the other commercial facilities in that building closed down after those cracks were identified, the 5 garment factories there remained open. And when workers showed up for work the next morning, they were threatened with the loss of a month's wages and forced to go inside. And it wasn't long after that that the building collapsed, as you said, killing 1,134, mostly young women of color, and injuring over 2,500 more.
Am I right in thinking that 10 years ago, this huge, at that point, worst ever disaster in the garment industry, sparked new demands, new kinds of demands for action? Would you say it really was like a tipping point?
I think it was a tipping point, and I think that what happened at Rana Plaza was entirely preventable and also entirely predictable.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, it took a disaster at that scale to generate the kind of public pressure, media attention, and consumer outrage that ultimately compelled all of those brands you mentioned to sign on to what is known as the Accord on Fire and Building Safety, that's had a tremendously positive impact in Bangladesh, and we hope will have the same impact in Pakistan. But it really was, as you said, it was the tipping point that got us that tremendously successful program.
Was it easy to get the accord? You were involved.
It was not easy. No, it was not easy. I mean, it really, there were organizations and labor unions and advocates that had been asking brands to take these kinds of steps for many years before. And it wasn't until the Rana Plaza disaster was pasted across front page news for weeks that some brands, the ones that have now signed on and are part of the program, agreed to step up. But there are many brands that still haven't, and so it's certainly the case that there are a lot of brands that still haven't gotten the right message.
And do we always know where our clothing is coming from when we buy it from one of those well-known brands, Teresa?
Well, you can look at the tag on the back of your clothes and you can see the country that it's coming from. And actually, a lot of major brands and retailers now disclose the factories that they source from. And brands and retailers know exactly where their clothing is coming from. It's coming from Asia and Africa and Latin America, from countries that have some of the worst working conditions, the lowest wages, and all of the various abuses, Laura, that you mentioned at the outset of the program.
But you're confident that those 170 that have signed on to this new accord, this newly expanded accord, can be relied on not to be operating in dangerous conditions, or for their workers not to be in dangerous conditions?
Well, it's important to make that distinction, and I think that's a good point. The program covers health and safety in Bangladesh, and as you noted, is now expanding into Pakistan. And where those brands that have signed and participate in the program are operating in those countries, yes, there are substantial and significant improvements being made. But that does not mean that those brands are engaging in those types of activities or programs everywhere in their supply chain.
Yeah.
And so it is important to be clear about where the program is, what it's doing, and where it's not, and what it's not doing there.
There have been some initiatives right here in New York, and NICOSH has been involved in some of those. Can you talk a little bit about what's sort of in the offing, what's working, what's not in terms of implementation, holding these companies to account and making sure that some of this, some of these accords are actually abided by?
Absolutely. I think that one of the main ways to make sure that these accords are being followed is by listening to the workers themselves. You know what Teresa said, that workers themselves saw cracks in the building, that workers themselves are canaries in the coal mine, quite literally in these cases, and that we have to have ways to make sure that we have access to these workers, that they're able to communicate with union leaders, that they're able to communicate with shop stewards potentially in unionized environments, or that there are ways that they can report. I mean, one of the biggest things that we hear about in New York State and New York City is that workers don't know who to call when there's an issue. It's just like anybody in any part of New York society, right? If you have an issue, let's say you see something happening, what do you do? Do you call 311? Do you call 911? Who do you call?
Who do you call?
Exactly. Exactly.
Right.
So for some workers, they might call OSHA, but if there's not a risk of immediate threat to life, OSHA might not follow up on that complaint for many months.
OSHA being the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, federal agency.
Exactly, a federal agency. They might call the Department of Labor if there's a wage theft claim, but we know that the Department of Labor is not properly funded. So again, I say listen to the workers, but who is picking up those phone calls? And so that's where I think unionized labor steps in, and where we need to have more representation on these different job sites.
Now, there has been action at some state levels. California, as I understand it, New York has a bill pending. Teresa, coming back to you, who is responsible for negotiating, implementing these accords, and then can states effectively lead the way?
Yeah, well, and I absolutely agree with Charlene. The ability of workers to speak up and speak out and to file complaints when there are issues in the workplace or serious health and safety issues is so critical. And unfortunately, workers in the United States and internationally in the garment industry often don't have the right to speak up or to organize. As you're referencing, there are some pieces of legislation that have recently come about that are designed to address some of the outstanding issues in the garment industry domestically. So in California, we have legislation there, SB 62, which went into effect in January of 2022, that eliminates piece rate payments and creates what is called joint and several liability for wage and hour violations for brands and retailers. And so what that means is that normally, under normal circumstances, workers employed at a garment factory are making clothing for brands and retailers, but they're not employed by those companies. Right. They're employed by the local factory. It's considered a subcontractor. And so legally, when they're not paid appropriately, they have no recourse to go to the brands and retailers and ask for payment or ask for that to be addressed. They can only, under the law, go to their direct employer, the factory. But under California's SB 62, and under a similar piece of legislation at the federal level called the Fabric Act that was filed by New York Senator Kirsten Gillibrand, workers would have the ability to hold the brands and retailers accountable. Mm-hmm. And that is so critical because in the garment supply chain, and indeed in many supply chains, brands and retailers are the ones who make the most profit and who have the greatest ability to ensure that workers' rights abuses are addressed. And so they have to be the ones who are being held accountable in the legislation or whatever the approach may be.
All right, we're going to take a quick break and be back more with our guests here on CityWorks after this.
The CUNY School of Labor and Urban Studies is the 25th and newest school under the CUNY umbrella. Dedicated to public service and social justice, the CUNY School of Labor and Urban Studies offers undergraduate and graduate degrees in the areas of labor studies and urban studies, and certificate programs in labor relations, public administration and public policy, healthcare policy and administration, and community leadership. We pride ourselves on being an institution that brings together activists and academics. Find out more at slu.cuny.edu.
We're back with Charlene Obernower, Executive Director of NICOSH, and Teresa Haas, who's Director of Global Strategies for Workers United. Coming to you, Charlene, we are here in New York, and we, are aware of the history here, but it is 100 years since the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire. How would you assess how we're doing and how you're doing? You scored some victories this year, specifically for the nail salon workers, but some others as well.
Definitely. I think that one of the biggest challenges that New York has anytime we have a legislative victory is how is it enforced? And I think that's one of the big obstacles. So to highlight one victory we had is Carlos's law, which increases the penalties among employers if they violate health and safety law and they're found to be criminally negligent.
Now that was sparked by a sort of spike in scaffolding deaths by construction workers, specifically in the city.
Absolutely. We put all of this energy and attention into getting legislation passed, but we need to put just as much energy into making sure that that legislation is then making an impact for workers.
And what's happening with the nail salon workers? They had some legislation go into effect, I believe, this October?
Yes, so in nail salons in October, now every single nail salon in New York State must have ventilation, which as with COVID, we know that ventilation is critical, but also with nail salon workers, they deal with a toxic cocktail of chemicals on the job. And so this is making sure that that air is filtered out and that fresh air is filtered in. So we called it a breath of fresh air, right? They're able to breathe better, but we have to make sure that this legislation is being implemented. So we have additional legislation now called the Nail Salon Minimum Standards Council Act, which sets up a permanent industry council of workers, of employers, and of industry experts that would make sure that these standards are the minimum standards are being followed and that new standards are able to be implemented. So this is one of the key things, is just like, how do we make sure that we're consistently getting these laws to be real for workers, not that they're just on the books.
And who is the we in this instance? We often celebrate these David versus Goliath victories, but Davids need some help, and where are they getting it from?
So in the case of the nail salon campaign, the New York Healthy Nail Salons Coalition is run by our organization. Workers United is also on the steering committee, so we have family there. And then also Adhikar, which is a workers' center of Nepali workers out in Jackson Heights, Queens.
It comes back to you on that too, Teresa, on this question of who the we is in all of this. I mean, I think the two of you actually met doing student sweatshop, anti-sweatshop organizing. And many of us, I think, remember when that was hot on campuses, sweat-free zones, you name it. I don't see quite as much of that ferment on campuses today. There's plenty of other things to be excited about. But how do players work together? Grassroots organizations like that one, with unions, with international unions, with global accord maintainers and implementers, and federal governments.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, and those coalitions are so critical. The coalition that Charlene mentioned and the coalitions that have been part of winning victories like the Accord have been so important. And our union has been part of those coalitions along with garment unions globally in the producing countries, and also with global NGOs. We're part of a campaign right now to press Levi's to join the Accord. They're one of the major companies that has refused to join the Accord, although so many of their peers and competitors have done so. And our union has joined with unions globally and with nonprofits and civil society in a campaign to press them to do the right thing. And so, we believe that those coalitions are critical to generating the kind of consumer and worker pressure that is necessary to bring major brands like Levi's and Adidas and Nike and others to the table with workers.
I mean, I'm kind of shocked that Levi's has not been forced to sign. Do they just feel like they're big enough to get away with it?
I think that brands kind of make this calculation of, do the consumers care enough? Are the workers' labor unions going to make a big enough of a stink about it? And I don't know who they hire for their PR, but they make kind of these calculations. And so, as Teresa was mentioning, these coalitions, one of the reasons I think they're so important, and one thing we've, talked about a lot with the nail salon campaign, is how do we get consumers involved, and how do we make sure that consumers care enough and raise enough of a stink that the brands have to, make some concessions.
All right, so how do we? I mean, we're in a period where consumers are aware of inflationary pressure. They may not know why they're facing increasing prices. They may not realize it has mostly to do with profits, going back to shareholders instead of to, price reductions. But they are aware that they're looking for good bargains, and people are feeling it in their pocketbook. How important is it that we actually shift our understanding about what it takes to make a pair of pants?
Right. Well, from my perspective, right, I look at who has power, right? And there's one way to have power, and it's money. And that's a reality in our capitalist country. There's another way to have power, and it's organized people. So how do we organize enough people to care about these issues? And I think that's the big question. And in order to organize people, you also need money. So it's really a question of how are we resourcing ourselves as a labor movement, in our case as a nonprofit, so that we can get enough people to really care about these issues, and we can actually get the brands to change their efforts and their perspectives.
Anything you would add to that, Teresa? I mean, it's unrealistic what we actually pay in this country for a whole lot of manufactured garments.
It is, that's true. And I think Charlene is right. It comes down to money and to organizing. And I think when it comes to money, brands, even throughout the COVID-19 pandemic, raked in massive profits. And yet they continue to claim poverty when it comes to things like worker rights. And so although it is true that we could ask consumers to pay more for their goods, it's true that clothing in this country is artificially cheap, it's also true that brands could afford to pay a little bit more money too for the goods that they source from all around the world. The CEOs could afford to have one fewer yacht, for example. They would still be okay, I think.
So where do we go from here? And Teresa, let's start with you. We have an administration in Washington right now that, at least according to Joe Biden, the State of the Union address this February, is pledging to revitalize domestic manufacturing. Will this filter down to garment manufacturing, things like that?
Well, the Fabric Act that I mentioned earlier, which is proposed in Congress and is waiting to be assigned to committee, that would apply to garment manufacturing, and it does include money and funding for incentivizing onshoring of garment manufacturing, as well as the joint and several labor provisions I mentioned, which would protect workers' wages and ensure that brands are held accountable. And so we would very much hope to see Congress move that bill forward and pass it. And that would be, I think, a great boost both for domestic garment manufacturers and for workers.
Is there any chance that you might find bipartisan support for such a thing?
I think so. You know, at the onshoring provisions, the incentives for domestic manufacturing, I think can appeal to both sides of the aisle. And so our hope is that it will move forward. Yes.
And coming back to you, Charlene, that the idea that if we bring it home, everything will be all right is also kind of misguided.
Absolutely.
I mean, some of the conditions I've seen in this country, certainly mimic what you see elsewhere.
Absolutely, and I think there is also an overlap in the right and the left of saying, oh, everything has to be made in America. But I think it's the responsibility of the left to say, okay, what kinds of jobs are these that we're creating if they are being created at home? And I would argue that in manufacturing in the United States, if you're talking about a good job, it's got to be a union job. So I'd like to see unionization attached to a lot of these promises, because if not, then what do we really have? You know, it's going to be another sweatshops. Me and Teresa are going to be back on campus protesting.
Well, I'm certainly going to be thinking twice before I put my Levi's back on. But Teresa, coming to you finally, I mean, we have a little time still to encourage people to get involved, to get aware, to think about what they can do. But it's a delicate balance, isn't it? In the sense that you don't want to put all the pressure on the consumers. You don't put all the pressure on the consumers. There is legislation pending. This entire subject, it seems to me, around worker safety has gotten, I don't want to say another breath of life because we've been talking about breath, but has gotten a little bit additional attention after COVID, that people do realize how precious their health is and their health protections, including on the job.
That's right. That's absolutely right. And there are campaigns, in addition to the Accord campaign and our work to pressure Levi's to join the Accord, there's another campaign that we're a part of, again, with global garment unions and NGOs, to pressure Adidas to rectify the problems in its factories from the COVID-19 pandemic. We didn't even really get to talk about all of the ways in which that pandemic devastated the garment industry, and the bad behavior of companies like Adidas has left workers vulnerable and in very serious straits. And so our union is going to continue to be part of these global campaigns to press companies like Levi's and like Adidas to do right by their workers and to share some of their massive profits with the workers who make it.
What did happen at Adidas?
Well, Adidas is one of the is a company, along with unfortunately a number of others, where in the course of the pandemic, when there was reduced consumer demand, many garment brands and retailers reduced orders to their suppliers, withdrew orders, refused to pay for orders. And that left suppliers without the resources to pay their workers. And so our union and many others are demanding that companies like Adidas take responsibility for their actions during the pandemic.
And on the New York front, where do you think things stand vis-a-vis COVID, maybe clarifying how serious this is?
I think that COVID really brought workers' health and safety to the forefront for a lot of people. People started to think about their own jobs and were they safe, and even thinking about their home office setups and, you know, is my back hurting from being on this computer too long?
Yes,
and
it
is. On my couch, yeah. So I think it really brought some of these issues home for people, and definitely for NYCOSH made us more of like a household name for people, I think. You know, I think people really started to realize, oh, wow, this is something that, you know, every occupation has to deal with in regards to COVID. So in some ways, I think it was an awakening for people, but we still have a long ways to go for really having workers' health and safety in this country.
When you walk by, and there's a plaque, I think, on the building now in the village near Washington Square Park, the original site of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, what do you think? What's your message to the people that lost their lives there? Do you think about them as you go by?
A few months ago, I want to say about a year ago, I did find myself walking by and looking at the site. And I always think about the images that you know, if you've watched like the Triangle movie on HBO or any of these other movies, I think about what some of those images were at the time and of the women and some men who did die. And I think about how far have we really come? And it just helps me continue to be dedicated to the work, to the labor movement, to the work at NICOSH, and just to really try to create those better jobs for people and to make that difference.
Teresa, what about you?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I do want to just mention there's going to be a memorial that's going to be unveiled in memoriam for the victims of the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire. But I also want to say that when I think about that fire, what I think about is the fact that we have outsourced our tragedies to other countries. The Triangle Shirtwaist Fire was uncannily similar to deadly fires that have happened in Bangladesh and Pakistan in the past 10 or 15 years. And we know very well in this country and elsewhere how to build safe buildings that workers can get out of. And it is only really because of the greed and the profit desires of the major brands and retailers that we don't have those kinds of safe buildings everywhere in the world in the garment industry.
Well, thank you so much, both of you. Charlene Obernour, Executive Director of NICOSH, Teresa Haas, Director of Global Strategies for Workers United. That's it for CityWorks this time. If you have comments or questions, please don't hesitate to email us at cityworks@slu.cuny.edu. For CityWorks, I'm Laura Flanders. Thanks for joining us.